What would you do if your HOA president dug a trench around your house to drive you out, only for your hidden cameras to expose everything? Imagine waking up one morning to the sound of heavy equipment outside your window, only to realize it's not construction for the neighborhood, but right on your property line. Dirt flying, men digging, and your driveway nearly cut off from the street. That's exactly what happened to Harold Jennings, a 52-year-old man who thought he was moving into a peaceful community just outside Round Rock, Texas. When Harold first bought the single-story brick house on Sandalwood Drive, he felt like he'd finally made it. After years of long shifts managing a logistics warehouse, he had saved enough to settle in a neighborhood where the lawns were trimmed, the sidewalks were clean, and kids played outside without worry. He pictured backyard barbecues, neighbors greeting each other by name, maybe even finding a sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. But the welcome wagon never came. Instead, what greeted him was a neatly typed letter taped to his front door only a week after moving in. It was from the Homeowners Association, signed by the president herself, Linda Marston. The letter was polite on the surface, but Harold could feel the edge in every sentence. Your mailbox color does not match approved guidelines. Please repaint within 10 business days. Harold stared at the white mailbox, which he thought looked fine. It wasn't neon, it wasn't rusted. It was just white. But to Linda, it was already an infraction. That was the first of many. Within 2 weeks, he received another notice, this time about his trash bins being visible from the street. A week later, one about the length of his grass. Harold cut it down the next day, but 2 days later, another slip showed up, this one claiming his hedges were inconsistent with community standards. At first, Harold laughed it off. "This woman must not have enough to do," he muttered one evening, showing the notices to his sister over FaceTime. She rolled her eyes, told him to keep his head down and not make waves. "It's just how some HOA people are," she said. But the thing was, other houses had trash bins out. Other lawns had weeds sprouting. And not once did he see a letter taped to anyone else's door. The final straw in that first month came on a Saturday afternoon. Harold had parked his Ford F-150 on the street in front of his house while rearranging boxes in the garage. He noticed Linda walking by, a clipboard tucked under her arm. She slowed down as she passed his truck, then shook her head and scribbled something on her paper. That's when Harold decided he wasn't imagining it. She wasn't just enforcing rules, she was targeting him. One evening, Harold saw her again when he was unloading groceries. He decided to speak up. "Ms. Marston, can I ask you something?" he called out, keeping his tone polite. She turned, her short grey hair neatly pinned, her pearl earrings catching the porch light. "Yes? Why do I keep getting notices for things I see other people doing? Their trash cans, their lawns. It's all the same as mine." Linda pressed her lips into a thin smile. "Mr. Jennings, the rules are applied equally. If others are in violation, they'll be addressed. But your property is under review because you're new, and we like to ensure new residents start off on the right foot." Harold frowned. "So I'm being watched more closely?" "Consider it guidance," she said. Then she gave a tight nod and walked off before he could reply. That night, Harold sat at his kitchen table staring at the latest notice. His stomach burned with frustration. He wasn't new to hard work. He wasn't sloppy. And yet here, in this so-called perfect neighborhood, he was already the outsider. It wasn't just about mailboxes and hedges anymore. He could feel it. Something in the way she looked at him. Something in the way neighbors avoided eye contact when she was around. So Harold did something he'd never considered before. He started buying small security cameras. Nothing fancy, just the kind you can hide under the edge of the roof line or behind a light fixture. He told himself it was just for peace of mind. But deep down, he already knew. Something bigger was brewing. But Harold had no idea just how far Linda was willing to go, and those little cameras would soon capture everything. Harold thought maybe the letters would stop once he proved himself willing to play along. After all, he wasn't the type to let his property go. He painted the mailbox a bland beige from the HOA's list, kept the bins tucked neatly behind the side gate, and even paid a landscaper twice that month just to keep the grass at community standard. But the letters didn't stop. If anything, they multiplied. On a Tuesday morning, Harold came home from work and found another violation notice waiting. This one claimed his front porch light was too bright and distracting to drivers. Harold laughed bitterly. It was the same bulb that came with the house. Hardly a spotlight. Later that week, another one landed on his door. Garden hose visible. Please remove immediately. A garden hose? Harold shook his head in disbelief. The moment he began feeling cornered, he noticed something else. Neighbors watching. When Harold walked his dog in the evenings, people waved politely, but their eyes lingered a little too long. On Sundays, when he drove past the HOA clubhouse, he sometimes saw Linda sitting with 2 or 3 other board members, sipping coffee as if planning their next move. One neighbor, Janet Ruiz, a middle-aged woman across the street, finally pulled Harold aside one morning. She lowered her voice. Look, I don't want to get involved, but Linda's particular. If she doesn't like someone, she'll find reasons to make their life harder. Harold narrowed his eyes. Why me, though? I've only been here a month. Janet shrugged uncomfortably. She's been president for 12 years. Some people say she likes things a certain way, others... She hesitated, glancing back toward her house. Others think she just picks her battles depending on the person. That word, depending, stuck in Harold's head. The final blow came when Harold received a certified letter in the mail. It wasn't just another warning slip. This one carried a $250 fine for non-compliance with property standards. The reason listed? Unapproved decorative item visible from the street. The so-called decorative item was an American flag Harold had placed on a pole in front of his house. That night, Harold stood on his porch staring at the flag swaying in the breeze. He felt a heat in his chest, part anger, part humiliation. His father had served in the army. That flag wasn't just fabric. And now it was unapproved? When he saw Linda the next morning making her rounds with her clipboard, he decided he'd had enough. Linda, he called, walking down his driveway. She stopped, looked at him, and adjusted her glasses. Yes, Mr. Jennings? I want to know why every little thing I do is a violation. A hose, a light bulb, a flag? No one else is getting these notices. She crossed her arms. Mr. Jennings, this neighborhood has standards. If you feel singled out, that is not my intention. But as president, it's my duty to maintain order. Order. Harold's voice rose. You're harassing me. And I'm not the only one who sees it. Linda's expression hardened. I'd advise you to choose your words carefully. These rules are for everyone's benefit. If you can't follow them, perhaps this isn't the right community for you. The conversation ended there, but Harold could feel neighbors peeking through blinds and curtains as he turned back toward his house. That was the thing about these neighborhoods. Everyone saw everything, but nobody wanted to get in the middle of it. That night, Harold sat in his living room replaying the argument in his head. He felt the walls of his new home closing in, like the place he had worked so hard to buy was already turning into a cage. But when he checked his security footage that evening, he caught something unusual. Linda stopping at his driveway after dark, standing still, looking at his house for several minutes before walking away. She hadn't noticed the small camera tucked near his porch light. Harold leaned closer to the screen, unease curling in his stomach. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. But Harold didn't yet know how personal it would get, and the next confrontation would play out in front of half the neighborhood. It was a Saturday afternoon in late spring, the kind of day when kids should have been riding bikes and neighbors mowing lawns. But for Harold, it turned into a showdown he couldn't avoid. He had just finished trimming his hedges when he noticed Linda at the corner of the block, clipboard tucked under her arm as usual. She was walking slowly down the street, inspecting each property like a general surveying troops. Harold felt his chest tighten. The notices, the fines, the stares, it all boiled over. He dropped his gloves, wiped his hands on his jeans, and stepped toward the sidewalk. Linda, he called, his voice steady but firm. She turned, surprised by his tone. Mr. Jennings, she replied coolly. I trust you're keeping things in order today. I'm doing fine, Harold said, stopping just a few feet from her. But we need to talk. Several neighbors paused mid-task. A man washing his car across the street slowed the hose. Janet Ruiz peeked from behind her blinds. People weren't looking away this time. They wanted to see what happened. "You've been hitting me with citations non-stop," Harold continued. "Mailbox, lawn, porch light, even my flag. I've done everything you asked, but the letters keep coming. What's really going on here?" Linda pursed her lips. "Mr. Jennings, you seem to think you're being treated differently." "That is not the case. Every resident is expected to follow the guidelines. If you feel they're unfair, perhaps you should review your homeowner packet more closely." Harold's jaw tightened. "Don't talk down to me." "I've read every page, but I also see trash cans left out across the street, grass higher than mine 3 doors down, paint peeling on the house next to yours. Funny, I don't see letters on their doors." A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had formed on the sidewalks. Neighbors who'd been silent for weeks suddenly looked uneasy. Linda adjusted her clipboard. "I will not stand here and justify every decision I make as president. If you'd like to bring concerns, you may attend the next board meeting." "I don't need a meeting," Harold interrupted. His voice was louder now. "I need you to stop targeting me." That word, targeting, hung in the air like smoke. A man from down the block, Richard Hanley, cleared his throat. "Maybe he's got a point," he muttered, loud enough for people to hear. Linda whipped around. "Excuse me?" Richard shrugged, stepping forward. "I've lived here 10 years. I've left my bins out for days sometimes, never got a notice. But Harold's been here, 2 months? And he's drowning in fines already. Doesn't add up." A few neighbors nodded, murmuring in agreement. Others avoided eye contact, unwilling to pick a side. Linda's face flushed. "This is not a public debate. Mr. Jennings has received violations because he has not met the standards." "End of story." "No," Harold said firmly. "Not end of story. Because I've started documenting everything. And I'll be ready to show it when the time comes." The mention of documentation caught her off guard. For a split second, her eyes flickered. Uncertainty, maybe even fear. Then she quickly composed herself. "Do as you wish," she said coldly, turning to leave. "But the rules will not change for you." The crowd slowly dispersed, neighbors whispering as they returned to their chores. Harold stood rooted on the sidewalk, heart pounding. He hadn't planned to call her out in front of everyone, but once the words left his mouth, he didn't regret them. As he headed back to his house, Janet hurried over from across the street. Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Be careful, Harold. She doesn't like being challenged. If you push too hard, she'll push back harder." Harold sighed. She already has. That night, Harold sat on his porch with his dog at his feet, staring at the trench of tension that had opened between him and the HOA president. He knew Linda wasn't finished. He could see it in her eyes before she walked away. But Harold didn't realize her next move wouldn't just be another notice on his door. It would involve tearing up the very ground around his home. 2 weeks passed after that public clash, and Harold noticed something strange. No new letters, no fines, no knocks on the door from Linda. For a brief moment, he wondered if calling her out in front of the neighbors had finally forced her to back off. He let himself breathe again, trimming the lawn on weekends and sipping coffee on his porch without waiting for the sound of paper flapping against the door. But then came the rumble. It was a Tuesday morning when Harold was leaving for work, coffee in hand, truck keys jingling. He froze halfway down the driveway when he saw a flatbed truck parked at the end of the street, loaded with shovels, pickaxes, and orange construction cones. 4 men in neon vests were unloading equipment, talking loudly. And there, at the center of it all, stood Linda, clipboard in hand, giving directions like she owned the entire block. Harold walked closer. "Morning," he said cautiously. "What's going on?" She glanced at him briefly, her smile tight. "Drainage improvements. We've had complaints about water pooling during heavy rain. The board approved a trench system to help direct runoff." Harold frowned. He'd lived there almost 3 months now. Not once had he seen water pooling anywhere near his property. "Funny, I haven't noticed any drainage issues." Linda clicked her pen against the clipboard. "That's because you're new, Mr. Jennings. You haven't been here long enough to notice." Something about the way she said it made his stomach knot. He watched the workers set up cones right at the edge of his lawn. Then they began to dig, heavy shovels biting into the soil, carving a line along his property. "Hold up," Harold said, stepping closer. "This trench, how far's it going?" "Perimeter adjustments," Linda replied flatly. "Completely standard." "Nothing to worry about. Looks like it's circling my whole yard." Harold shot back. "Coincidence," she said smoothly, though her eyes betrayed the smallest flicker of satisfaction. Harold stood there, stunned, as the men kept digging. Each scoop of dirt flung over their shoulders felt like another insult. The trench wrapped slowly around the edges of his property, inch by inch. When they reached his driveway, one of the workers paused. "Ma'am, you want us to cut through here too?" Linda nodded. "Yes, all the way." Harold's voice sharpened. "Wait a minute, you're blocking my driveway." "Temporary inconvenience," she said, not looking at him. "For the greater good of the neighborhood." Neighbors began to gather on porches, watching the bizarre scene. Some whispered among themselves. Others pretended to water plants just to get a better look. Janet Ruiz crossed her arms from across the street, her face tight with worry. Harold felt his blood pressure spike. "This is harassment. You can't just tear up my yard like this." Linda turned slowly, her voice calm but cutting. "Mr. Jennings, everything we're doing has been approved by the HOA board. If you'd like to contest it, you can bring it up at the next meeting. Until then, I'd suggest stepping aside and letting the work proceed." One of the workers hesitated. "Sir, you want us to stop?" Harold opened his mouth, then shut it again. He knew if he said yes, Linda would twist it into non-compliance. If he said nothing, his property would be surrounded by a trench like a moat around a castle. He clenched his fists. "Do your job," he muttered to the worker, glaring at Linda. "This isn't over." The digging went on all day. By evening, Harold's house looked ridiculous. A deep trench carved around 3 sides of his yard, with the driveway nearly impossible to access without driving over a mound of dirt. He stood there in silence as the crew packed up, Linda thanking them sweetly before heading back to her spotless 2-story home. That night, Harold couldn't sleep. He walked from window to window, looking at the damage lit faintly by streetlights. His mind ran wild. If she could get away with this, what was next? Would she fine him for fixing it? Would she demand he pay for repairs? But Harold had something Linda didn't know about. He pulled out his laptop, opened the security feed, and clicked through the footage. The cameras had caught everything. Linda pointing where the trench should go, directing the workers to the driveway, standing with her arms crossed as though she were orchestrating the entire attack. Harold leaned back in his chair, his anger hardening into determination. She thought she had outsmarted him, but she hadn't counted on the fact that he was already recording every move. But Harold wasn't ready to reveal his hand yet, because the real test would come when the neighborhood itself saw whose side they were truly on. When Harold stepped outside the next morning, it hit him all over again. His house looked less like a home and more like some kind of construction site abandoned mid-project. The trench ran along the property line like a scar in the earth, raw dirt piled high in uneven mounds. His driveway was half blocked, meaning he had to angle his truck like a puzzle piece just to back out. He stood there, arms crossed, as his dog tugged on the leash beside him. Across the street, Janet Ruiz gave a small, sympathetic wave, but didn't dare come closer. 2 doors down, Richard Hanley shook his head, muttering something to his wife before disappearing back inside. People noticed, but nobody wanted to be caught on Harold's side too openly. Harold muttered under his breath. "They're scared of her." He clipped the leash to the railing, grabbed his phone, and started taking pictures. Every angle, every mound of dirt, the blocked driveway, all of it. He even crouched low to get shots of the trench depth. Later, as he scrolled through the photos inside his kitchen, he could feel his stomach tighten. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was sabotage. And he couldn't shake the thought that it wasn't only about the HOA. That afternoon, Richard walked across the street while Harold was on the porch. He glanced around nervously before speaking. "Look, man, I don't like what's going on here either. But Linda's got a grip on this board. People are scared of fines, scared of her showing up with that clipboard. She's run this place like her own little empire for years." Harold leaned against the porch railing. "Yeah, I'm starting to figure that out." Richard lowered his voice. If you're thinking about going after her, you better have proof. Otherwise, she'll bury you in paperwork before you get anywhere. Harold almost smiled. That's the one thing I do have. Richard raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? Let's just say she forgot one important detail. She's being watched too. Richard's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't press. He just gave Harold a look that said, both be careful, and I hope you know what you're doing before heading back home. That night, Harold sat at his dining table, his laptop glowing in the dark room. He clicked play on the camera footage again. The video showed Linda in her usual pressed blouse and slacks, her pearl earrings glinting under the sun. She was pointing at the ground, motioning for the crew to dig deeper, walking along the property line as if she owned the land. At one point, she even leaned down to inspect the soil, nodding approvingly before moving on. Harold clenched his fists. The way she moved, the way she carried herself, it was as if his house was nothing more than a nuisance on her checklist. He thought about sending the video straight to the HOA board, but then he remembered what Richard said. She controlled them. They'd bury it, or worse, twist it against him. Instead, Harold decided to show a few trusted neighbors. The next day he invited Janet and Richard over, keeping his voice low so no one else would overhear. When the clip ended, Janet's mouth fell open. She told the workers where to dig, around your driveway. That's not drainage. That's personal. Exactly, Harold said. And this is just the start. I want to see what happens when more people realize what she's really doing. Richard rubbed the back of his neck. If this gets out, things are going to get ugly fast. Harold closed the laptop. They're already ugly. Now it's just about who's willing to admit it. That night, Harold stood at the window again, staring at the trench. He felt anger buzzing under his skin, but alongside it came something else. Resolve. He wasn't just going to sit back while Linda turned his dream home into a battlefield. But Harold also knew once the footage left his laptop and landed in other people's hands, there was no going back. The neighborhood would have to choose sides. For weeks Harold had felt powerless. Letters piled up, fines escalated, and now a trench sliced around his yard like a warning carved into the earth. But when he sat down at his desk, staring at the grainy footage from his hidden cameras, he finally felt the tables begin to turn. The cameras had been a spur-of-the-moment decision. After one too many notices taped to his door, Harold had gone to a hardware store in Austin and bought a set of discrete Wi-Fi security cameras. He'd mounted them himself, one tucked under the gutter pointing at the driveway, another hidden inside a hollowed garden light facing the street, and a third angled toward his front yard. He'd told no one, not even Janet or Richard. Now, watching the footage, he could see everything. Linda pointing, pacing, barking orders to the workers. At one point, she actually drew a line in the dirt with her shoe to show where they should dig. It wasn't some board-approved plan. It was her project. Harold leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. Got you. Later that evening, he called Janet over again. She sat at his dining table, her arms folded tightly, eyes fixed on the laptop screen as he replayed the video. This is clear as day, she whispered. She can't spin this. She's not just enforcing rules, she's creating her own. Harold nodded. The board won't care. She's got them wrapped around her finger. If I take this to them, it'll disappear. So what then? Janet asked. I show the right people, Harold said. Neighbors first. Let it spread. The next day, Harold invited Richard and another couple from down the block, Thomas and Elaine Brooks, to see the footage. He didn't make a scene. He just asked them over casually, closed the curtains, and pressed play. Thomas frowned, shaking his head. That's not drainage. No one digs a trench like that for drainage. Elaine pressed her lips together. And she's smiling while she does it. She knows exactly what she's doing. Richard looked at Harold. If this video gets out, you'll have support. But you'll also have a war on your hands. Harold leaned forward. I've been in a war since the day I moved here. The only difference is now I've got proof. For the first time, Harold noticed a shift in the air. The neighbors weren't just whispering about Linda anymore. They were starting to question her openly. Word spread quietly from one kitchen table to another. until half the block had either seen the video or heard about it. That weekend, Harold stood on his porch watering his plants when he caught Linda watching him from across the street. She lingered longer than usual, clipboard tucked tightly to her chest, eyes narrowed. Harold met her gaze and didn't look away. Later, as he reviewed the cameras again, he caught something chilling. Around 10 p.m., Linda walked up to the edge of his property. She didn't step onto his lawn, but she stood there for nearly 5 minutes, staring at his house in silence. Harold watched the footage 3 times, his pulse pounding. It wasn't inspection. It wasn't business. It was personal. He saved the clip, labeling it Night Watch. By now, Harold was documenting everything: the letters, the fines, the trench, the footage of her late-night visits. He kept a file on his laptop and a backup on a USB drive hidden in his truck. He wasn't just protecting himself. He was building a case. When he showed Janet the late-night clip, her face paled. "She's obsessed," she said softly. "This isn't about the HOA anymore." Harold closed the laptop with a snap. "Then it's time to show people exactly who she is." But Harold had no idea how quickly the footage would spread once it left his hands, and how the neighborhood would explode once the truth went public. By the end of that week, Harold's footage was no longer a quiet secret shown around kitchen tables. It was neighborhood currency. People whispered about it during morning dog walks, shared still images pulled from Harold's laptop, and compared notes about their own run-ins with the HOA president. It started small. Richard mentioned it to a couple of friends during a barbecue. Janet showed her sister, who lived 3 streets over, and word spread from there. By Sunday afternoon, Harold couldn't step outside without feeling the weight of eyes on him. Some neighbors gave him nods of encouragement, others crossed the street to avoid conversation. The neighborhood was no longer united under Linda's watch. It was fractured. The tension came to a head at the community pool. Harold had taken his dog for a walk when he overheard 2 residents, Pauline and Greg Sanders, whispering heatedly near the gate. "I'm telling you, Greg, I saw it with my own eyes," Pauline said, clutching her tote bag. She told those workers to dig like it was her personal project. That trench wasn't about drainage. It was about him, Greg sighed, shaking his head. "Pauline, Linda's been president for over a decade. She knows the bylaws better than anyone. If she said it was drainage, maybe it was drainage." Pauline crossed her arms. "Then why didn't she notify the rest of us? Why no paperwork? Why no vote?" Harold cleared his throat as he passed. Both of them went silent. Pauline gave him a tight smile. Greg just looked away. Back home, Harold felt the air buzzing with unspoken conflict. The cameras had caught the truth, but truth had a way of making people uncomfortable. Some neighbors welcomed it, others resisted it. Nobody wanted to be the first to openly take sides. That changed at the next HOA meeting. Harold didn't usually attend. They were notorious for dragging on about landscaping budgets and pool rules. But this time, he sat right in the front row. The room at the clubhouse was packed. Folding chairs lined the walls. People who never showed up suddenly seemed interested. Linda sat at the head table in her usual spot, flanked by 2 board members who looked more nervous than confident. She shuffled papers, avoiding Harold's eyes. The meeting opened with the usual agenda, but murmurs rippled through the room until Richard finally stood up. "Before we talk about dues," he said loudly, "I think we need to address what everyone here has already seen, the trench around Harold Jennings' house." The room stirred. Someone cleared their throat. A woman in the back whispered, "Finally." Linda tapped her pen on the table. That project was approved under Section 14, subsection C of the bylaws. It was a necessary improvement for drainage control. Harold stood. His heart hammered, but his voice came out steady. "If that's the case, then maybe you'd like to explain this." He turned his laptop toward the crowd. On the screen, the video played. Linda pointing to the ground, drawing a line with her shoe, ordering the workers to dig deeper. Gasps broke out around the room. Janet spoke up. "Drainage? Then why block his driveway?" Linda's cheeks flushed. "That was temporary." "Temporary?" Thomas Brooks scoffed from the second row. "My wife and I saw the footage too. You weren't managing drainage, you were managing Harold." The room erupted with voices, some angry, some defensive. A woman shouted, "I got fined for leaving my Christmas lights up too long. Was that really in the bylaws too?" Another man muttered, "She's been doing this for years." "We just never had proof." Linda slammed her pen down. "Enough! This is nothing but an attempt to smear me. Mr. Jennings clearly edited that footage to make me look guilty." Harold's blood boiled. "You can call it fake, but the cameras don't lie. I didn't want to do this, but I'm not letting you ruin my home to feed your ego." The crowd was split, half glaring at Linda, half unsure whether to speak up. Harold could feel the line being drawn. That night, after the meeting, a group of neighbors approached Harold in the parking lot. Pauline, Janet, and Thomas among them. "You're not alone," Pauline said firmly. "People are waking up to what she's been doing, but this won't stop here. She's not going down without a fight." Harold looked around at their faces, some determined, some scared, but all of them waiting for what came next. But the moment Harold decided to take the footage beyond the neighborhood, everything escalated into something none of them were prepared for. Harold didn't sleep much after that HOA meeting. The room had split down the middle, half the neighbors angry and emboldened, the other half silent but watchful. And Linda? She left without looking at anyone, storming out with her clipboard clutched like a shield. But Harold knew something. Once people saw the footage outside of this cul-de-sac, Linda wouldn't be able to brush it off as edited or taken out of context. The truth would have legs. The next morning, he sat at his kitchen table staring at his laptop. The footage was already saved in multiple places: hard drive, USB stick, even uploaded to a private folder online. For weeks he'd hesitated, but now he clicked the button he'd been avoiding: upload. He didn't add dramatic music or slick editing. He simply titled the video, "HOA President Orders Trench Around My Home, Caught on Camera." He hit publish on YouTube and cross-posted it to Facebook. By lunchtime, the video had a few hundred views. By evening, thousands, and the comments poured in. "Classic HOA abuse. They think they run your life. This is targeted harassment. No drainage project looks like that. Good on you for having cameras. She'd have denied it otherwise." Neighbors who had avoided him suddenly texted links to the video, saying, "Saw this online. Unbelievable." Even Janet called late that night, her voice buzzing with shock. "Harold, people from outside the neighborhood are talking about it. It's on a local news blog already." Sure enough, by the next day, a reporter from KVUE Austin reached out for comment. Harold didn't know whether to feel proud or terrified. Cameras and microphones were no longer hidden in his gutters. They were now in his front yard. He stood on his porch in a collared shirt, trying to keep his voice steady as he told the reporter, "I bought this home to build a future. Instead, I've been harassed for minor things and now had a trench dug around my yard without consent. If I didn't have cameras, no one would believe me." The reporter nodded gravely, turning the microphone to capture the trench still visible, the dirt still piled high. That night, the segment aired. It was short, 3 minutes long, but powerful. Viewers across the city saw Linda in the video, directing workers like a foreman. They saw Harold, standing by the ruined edge of his driveway, describing how he'd been singled out since the day he moved in. The reaction was immediate. Emails flooded the HOA inbox. The board's phone line lit up. Neighbors whispered louder now, some defending Linda as strict but fair, others calling for her resignation. Meanwhile, Harold's phone buzzed non-stop. Old friends from out of town sent messages. "Is that really you on the news?" His co-workers pulled him aside the next day. "Man, you're all over the internet." But fame came with pressure. Strangers online began speculating, asking if race played a role, asking why Linda had chosen Harold specifically. The comments section became a battleground of its own. Harold scrolled through them late at night, torn between vindication and anxiety. He hadn't wanted the world's eyes on him. He just wanted peace in his own neighborhood. That peace, though, was long gone. The following evening, Harold noticed a group of board members huddled on Linda's porch. Their faces were tense, voices hushed. When they saw Harold watching from across the street, they quickly dispersed. Linda stayed behind, staring him down for a long moment before slamming her front door shut. Richard called shortly after. Harold, she's cornered now. She's not going to back down. Be careful, Harold rubbed his temples. At this point, I don't care if she likes me or not. I'm not moving, and I'm not hiding. Still, he knew Richard was right. The more public this became, the more desperate Linda would get. And desperate people made reckless choices. But Harold hadn't yet seen just how reckless she could be, because the fallout was about to crash down on both of them in a way no one could control. By the following week, the neighborhood no longer felt like a quiet suburb outside Round Rock. It felt like the set of a reality show. News vans parked along Sandalwood Drive, journalists knocked on doors, asking neighbors for quotes. Strangers slowed their cars to snap photos of Harold's house, curious to see the infamous trench. For Harold, it was surreal. He went from being the quiet new guy to the center of a firestorm. At the grocery store, cashiers recognized him. At work, co-workers patted his back and joked, "Watch out! Don't let your boss dig a trench around your desk." Harold forced a laugh, but inside he felt worn down. The real storm, though, was inside the HOA itself. At an emergency board meeting, Linda tried to put on her usual air of authority. Sitting at the head of the long oak table, she clicked her pen and said, "We are not here to discuss rumors. We are here to protect the integrity of this neighborhood," but the board wasn't as compliant as usual. One member, Sharon Ellis, cleared her throat. "With all due respect, Linda, this isn't a rumor. The footage is real. I've seen it myself." Another board member, David Lopez, chimed in. "And the phones haven't stopped ringing. Residents want answers. Some are threatening to sue if we don't address this." Linda's voice sharpened. "You're overreacting." "It was a drainage project, nothing more." Sharon folded her arms. "Then why no permits filed with the city? Why no written notice to the homeowners? Why only Harold's yard?" The silence that followed was heavy. Word of the tension leaked almost immediately. Neighbors whispered about shouting behind closed doors, about one board member threatening to resign. By the weekend, Harold's phone buzzed with a text from Janet. "They're cracking from the inside. She's losing control." But Linda wasn't about to go quietly. The following Monday, Harold woke to another violation notice taped to his door. He ripped it off and read, "Failure to maintain yard cleanliness due to trench debris." His laugh was bitter. The debris was from the very project Linda had ordered. That same day, his mailbox was stuffed with anonymous notes. Some were supportive. "We stand with you," while others were scrawled with anger. "Stop stirring trouble. Leave if you don't like it here." At dusk, Harold sat on his porch, head in his hands, when Richard walked over. "Man, this is getting ugly," Richard said. "Half the block's ready to boot her, the other half is circling the wagons. It's like civil war out here." Harold sighed. "All I wanted was to live in peace. Now I can't even walk my dog without people whispering." Richard leaned against the railing. "You've got to decide what you want, Harold. If you keep pushing, she might get voted out. But if you stop now, she'll claw her way back and make your life worse than ever." Harold stared at the trench, its edges now crumbling after days of rain. "I didn't ask for this fight. But I'm not backing down." The breaking point came at a city council meeting. Someone had forwarded Harold's video to the local government, and it landed on the agenda. Harold spoke publicly, describing what had happened in front of council members, reporters, and dozens of residents. When he finished, one councilwoman leaned forward. "Mr. Jennings, this is not the first complaint we've received about this HOA. Your video may just be the spark that brings wider reform." Applause broke out from the audience. Harold glanced back and saw neighbors, Pauline, Janet, the Brooks couple, clapping. Even Richard gave a firm nod of support. But in the corner of the room sat Linda, her face pale but tight with fury. She didn't clap. She didn't stand. She simply stared at Harold with eyes that promised this wasn't over. That night, as Harold locked up his house, his cameras caught her again, standing across the street, long after dark, watching silently. He saved the clip without hesitation. But Harold knew the battle wasn't just about HOA politics anymore. It had become a test of resilience, and the real resolution was still to come. The following weeks dragged by like months. The trench remained, weathered now by rain, its muddy edges collapsing into ugly heaps that made Harold's front yard look like a construction zone abandoned mid-job. But for once, Harold didn't feel alone staring at it. More and more neighbors began stopping by, not just Janet or Richard, but families Harold barely knew before. Some came to apologize. Pauline Sanders arrived one afternoon with a casserole, awkwardly explaining, "I didn't speak up sooner because, well, you know how Linda is. But what she did to you was wrong. Everyone can see it now." Harold thanked her, not so much for the food, as for the courage it took to say those words aloud. Others came to offer quiet solidarity. A man Harold had only seen mowing his lawn before, Victor Malone, shook his hand firmly and said, "Took guts to stand up to her. You gave the rest of us a backbone." Meanwhile, Linda's world grew smaller. At HOA meetings, the once friendly murmurs that greeted her had turned into crossed arms and hard stares. 2 board members resigned outright, citing her misuse of authority. Rumors circulated that a petition for her removal was gathering signatures. The same neighbors who once obeyed her clipboard in silence now questioned every word out of her mouth. One evening, Harold heard a knock on his door. When he opened it, Linda herself stood there. She didn't have her clipboard. Her hair was pulled back messily, her face drawn tight with exhaustion. "Mr. Jennings," she began stiffly. "I'd like to talk." Harold leaned against the doorframe. "About the trench? Or about the harassment before that?" Her eyes flashed. "You've turned this neighborhood against me." "No," Harold said evenly. "You did that to yourself. All I did was show the truth." For a moment, she seemed ready to argue. But then her shoulders slumped. "I've given my life to this community. 12 years. And now they treat me like a criminal." Harold's tone softened slightly, though his guard stayed up. "Linda, rules are meant to keep people safe and fair, not to single someone out. You lost sight of that." She stared at him for a long time before muttering, "This isn't over." Then she turned and walked into the night. A month later, it was. The petition reached the required number of signatures, and Linda was officially removed as HOA president. A new interim board took over, promising transparency and fairness. One of their first actions was to order the trench around Harold's yard filled and restored at HOA expense. The morning the workers arrived, Harold stood on his porch with his coffee, watching as the dirt was smoothed back into place. For the first time in months, his yard looked whole again. His dog trotted happily along the grass as if reclaiming territory. Janet and Richard stopped by, clapping him on the back. "You did it," Richard said simply. But Harold shook his head. "We did it. Every one of us who spoke up, even in whispers, made this happen." The lesson wasn't lost on him. For weeks he'd felt alone, a single man against an entire system. But sometimes all it takes is one person willing to show the truth, to remind everyone else of their own power. That night, Harold walked the block with his dog. Neighbors waved, some stopping to chat for the first time since he'd moved in. The air felt lighter, freer, as though the neighborhood itself was exhaling. Standing in his driveway, Harold looked up at his house. It wasn't just brick and shingles anymore. It was a reminder that peace doesn't come from avoiding conflict. It comes from facing it head-on when you're pushed too far. The cameras were still in place, and Harold didn't plan to take them down anytime soon. Not out of fear, but out of wisdom. Sometimes you have to protect what's yours, and sometimes you have to show others that silence allows the wrong people to stay in power. He scratched his dog's head and smiled faintly. We're home now. Stories like Harold's remind us that standing up to intimidation isn't easy, but it matters. When one person chooses to fight back, it can change an entire community. If you want to hear more stories that reveal what really happens behind closed doors, make sure you subscribe. You won't want to miss what comes next.